Hello, this is the latest episode in our series of podcasts where we speak to Lancaster authors about their experiences of publishing an open access book. Today we are joined by Michael Hughes, who is a professor in history at Lancaster University. So hi Michael, thank you for joining us. Just to get us going, please can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your book?
Yeah, sure. My name's Michael Hughes and I'm Professor of Modern History here at Lancaster University. And I'm a Russian specialist. I publish mostly on either Russian history or Russia's relations with the wider world. And the book I've just published open access is called Felix Volhovsky, A Revolutionary Life. Felix Volhovsky is one of those people who has kind of disappeared from history, but he was an important figure in the Russian revolutionary movement. What's interesting about him, he's born in 1846. In a sense, his whole life is a kind of mirror of the growth of the Russian revolutionary movement. He died just before 1917. So I wrote the book really about his time in Russia. He fled Russia in 1890 and continued to involve himself in the revolution abroad. Really because I thought he was a fascinating and interesting figure in his own right, but also because he actually tells us a lot about the development of the Russian revolutionary movement. Unlike, say, Lenin or Trotsky, he was not a Bolshevik, he wasn't a Marxist, he was a populist. The populists were, if you like, the rather forgotten strand of the Russian revolutionary movement. But at the time, and right down to 1917, they were hugely important. So I suppose this book is slightly designed to change the way we think about the Russian revolutionary movement, think less about Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, the Bolsheviks, winners, if you like, who seized power, and move attention to those who've perhaps been rather forgotten by history. And it's a book, it took me 10 years to write. I visited archives in Russia, in North America, in Germany, in Holland, in Britain, in France. It's been a labour of love. You tend to fall in love with the person you're writing about. I'm not sure Felix Volhovsky was an entirely lovable person, but he was certainly a fascinating one. And I thoroughly enjoyed writing the book.
So you've published the book open access. What inspired you to do this?
I'd already published a book 10 years ago, open access. I am a great believer in open access publishing for a variety of reasons, actually. The first, from a personal point of view, I tend to write books that will have appeal beyond universities, beyond academics. The book I published 10 years ago on Stephen Graham, who was a rather eccentric traveller in Russia. Stephen Graham has become something of a cult figure in some circles. He's a very well-known sort of walker and traveller, and I actually did a programme on Radio 4 about it. And I knew if I published that as a kind of book costing a lot of money only in a few university libraries, then very few people would have read it. Because I published it open access, it's been viewed, when I last checked, downloaded over 20,000 times.
Wow.
I've had endless emails from Russia, from America, from family members I never knew about, from people who told me his involvement in intelligence activities, which I sort of knew about, but not entirely. You just sense I got to know a lot of stuff I wish I'd known when writing the book. But what it tapped into is a huge enthusiasm for Stephen Graham. So with Volhovsky, it's slightly different. The book, it's perhaps more of an academic audience, because obviously the Russian Revolution is much studied in universities around the world, much studied by students. But also there are a lot of people who are interested in the Russian Revolution movement who aren't necessarily interested in it from what you might call a narrowly scholarly perspective. So the book, as I wrote it, is meant to be readable. I put a lot in footnotes for people who really want to know about these things, but also it's the kind of book, I'm not saying, people are going to read it in the bath, but it's the kind of book people who are interested in Russia, the Russian Revolution, can pick up. What inspired me to publish your book, to give some kind of figures here, I actually just checked before I came over. My Stephen Graham book is accessible from about 1,600 university catalogues worldwide, as well as, of course, Google Books and just Googling it and other sources. Volhovsky, I noticed, only published a few weeks ago, is already on 700 library catalogues around the world, most of them not Britain. And and again from Google Books, from the published stuff at publishers. And what I realized is that it makes your work more accessible, yes, for academics, because university libraries are finding it increasingly difficult to afford monographs. So it gets it out to other academics, it gets it out to students, but it also gets my books out to people who, frankly, are never going to buy the book at full price, are probably not going to go to a university library to read it. So that's what kind of inspired me, really, to publish open access.
And can you walk us through the process of publishing open access? Did it differ perhaps from your experiences of publishing non-open access books?
Yes and no. I mean, I've published it. This was my 10th book, so I've mostly published what you might call fairly traditional books that by sort of publishers who charge for books. I've worked with a company called Open Book Publishers, who are a kind of leading, probably the leading publisher in this area in Britain. They've done a lot to develop open access, both technically, but also trying to develop new financial models. Now, I've worked with them because they're, I suppose, what we call a social enterprise, really. It's run by academics as a kind of collective is the right word, but it's run on very sort of collective lines. Actually, when it developed more than 10 years ago, a very strong kind of Russian focus, which is why I got involved. What's been interesting working with Open Book Publishers, and they publish, subject to very strict peer review, I'll come back to that in a minute. They don't charge a fee, as it were, to publish with them, but they use a variety of fundraising methods, charity, grants, and indeed universities that are able to provide funds to support academics who are publishing with them. And I wanted to support them because I thought it was a new kind of enterprise that was very interesting. But they adhere, other than that, to all the kind of principles you would expect from any publisher. I found them very efficient, very effective, very helpful. I found the peer review was extremely rigorous. I found the copy editing, without mentioning names, far superior to that I've encountered from some other publishers. I won't say anything, but what one was dealing with was a very, very professional publishing outlet. Now, I mean, a lot of the main academic publishers also publish open access, and they operate on very similar lines. The principle is very much the same, that the funding model is somewhat different. But it really makes no difference. You submit a proposal, it gets accepted, doesn't get accepted, the manuscript goes for peer review. Copy editing, what was particularly useful for me, there were two copy editors who knew Russian well and Ukrainian. Although I do know Russian and Ukrainian, it's very helpful to have people, a second pair of eyes, checking I transliterated properly. But essentially, the process is identical to that which I've had with other publishers. The outcome is different in the sense that the book is mainly distributed online, but we'll probably come to this in a minute. There's also hard copies, etc. So from the point of view of the author, open access really doesn't make very much difference to what you do. You propose, it gets accepted, you submit a manuscript, it gets peer reviewed, it gets copy edited, it gets published. It's all very, very similar. You don't notice a great deal of difference.
Did you face any challenges or obstacles when going through the open access publishing process?
No, absolutely none. As I say, I've worked with the same company, but I've also have colleagues who published open access with other publishers. And I think their experience has been the same as mine, that there is really no difference from mainstream, if that's the right word, publishing, or traditional publishing, if I can put it that way. It is exactly the same kind of process. Now, I say that because I think some academics who haven't published open access, it all is a bit mysterious to them. They don't quite know how it works. It really is identical. My own experience, as I say, I found everything from copy editing to peer reviewing, if anything, more efficient than other publishers I've worked with, but certainly as efficient. The quality, if I can put it that way, exactly the same. helpfulness exactly the same. So really, from the point of view of the author, publishing open access doesn't really make any difference. And I found very few problems. Because I publish with Open Book Publishers, this slightly unusual publisher that is a kind of social enterprise, I work with my university to find some funding for them, but they would have published the book anyway, as it were. But that's a rather different and slightly more technical aspect that's not about open access publishing, but about the model of this publisher.
We touched on this previously, but what impact will publishing open access have on potential audiences for your work?
I mean, this is the one I really would encourage academics to think about. I'm a Russian specialist, and generally speaking, my work is read more in continental Europe and North America and Russia than it is in Britain. Monographs are expensive. A lot of university libraries can no longer afford to buy traditional monographs. I actually looked at another monograph of mine I published 8 years ago, quite a sort of niche academic monograph, and I saw that there were only around 150 copies or so in university libraries worldwide. So that means even among academics, not many people are going to publish it. I looked at another book of mine, one that is sort of sold widely and well known, that has about 1,100 copies in university libraries worldwide, a lot less than my Stephen Graham book, not many more than Volhovsky after just a few weeks, and fewer, I think, than Volhovsky in a few more weeks. So even if one looks at scholarly audiences, open access publishing allows you to talk to far more colleagues, because most academics in Europe, in North America, work in libraries where budgets will be constrained, and they won't be able to buy everything that comes out. And therefore, you're getting there, you're getting onto student reading lists, you're getting onto academics' footnotes, let's be honest about it. In the modern world we work at, these kind of things matter. So even if really your focus is on scholarly audiences, I still think open access publishing has a lot to offer. But beyond that, particularly like me, but actually like a lot of academics, if you are publishing in areas where there's an audience beyond what you might call the traditional university student audience, again, there are a lot of people who are interested in books. Candidly, they're not going to pay 50, 60, 70 pounds for a hardback monograph, but they're certainly very interested in reading about it. And that's the thing. The publisher I've published open access with gives us very good metrics. And what is fascinating to me is to see the way people are accessing my book, the countries they're accessing it from. Quite a lot of my readers come from countries which are going to be financially constrained. Frankly, people are not going to buy the book. Most university libraries aren't going to buy the book. But more general kind of interest in it too. So I suppose I would encourage open access publishing for both kind of a scholarly way, if I can look at it, because I think you reach a bigger scholarly audience, but also an audience beyond the academy, a wider readership. And we know that readership is there.
And will a print copy of your book be published and sold?
It certainly will. I have a copy in my hands. It's nicely, I'm going to show this to Tom. It's nicely done. It's nicely published. I mean, interestingly, this is published paperback. It costs, and I can't remember, about $19.95, I think, which is a great deal less than an academic book of that kind would probably cost. The hardback is, I think, about £35 less than a traditional hardback monograph would cost. So yes, and I mean, I'm old-fashioned enough to a degree to like a copy. I mean, I confess I've not really looked at the hard copy. I look at the electronic copies, but it's there. I can put it on display cabinets. I can sort of give it to family members. But more seriously, some universities do continue to buy those hard copies, as it were. So yes, you do, and the production the production values are very high. Actually, I mean, I've been impressed. I mean, the front piece of mine is it's from memory, about a 1910 photograph of Volhovsky, which I discovered in an archive in Finland, I think. and it wasn't very good quality, but I worked with the publishers to, it's quite tough to actually make it of a reasonable quality. And, to be honest, with some other publishers, they've not been particularly interested in that kind of thing. So there certainly are hard copies. I think one also has to be hard-headed about this. I think most academics, certainly my generation, I'm venerable now, do like the idea of hard copies, but we all actually read most monographs online now. Now, I admit I like to sit down with a hard copy, but I've got to be brutally honest, I probably read 80 or 90% of monographs online myself. So in a sense, whether one likes it or not is perhaps what I'm saying. The digital medium is becoming more the way that academics and students actually consume, to use an unpleasant word, monographs. But yes, I do like to have that hard copy. I think virtually every open access publisher I'm aware of, either traditional publishers offering open access, will also offer hard copies, as it were. And I think the whole, I would actually encourage that, because I think there is still something quite nice about seeing those hard copies. But we are in a digital age, and I think we have to be hard-headed. Google searches, etc., tend to access books more effectively in the metadata if they are there. I know that shouldn't always be the case, but to be honest, it is, because a lot of publishers, they publish open access, their metadata usage is frankly more efficient, it's more effective. Your work is more discoverable.
The quality of the hard copy looks fantastic, and it must be nice to have a physical copy in your hand after so many years of work. Will you still receive royalties for the sales of those hard copies?
I don't, but I'm going to be quite honest about it. I have a relative who is one of those lucky people who writes best-selling sort of biographies that appear in Waterstones, and their royalties are significant. I'm afraid the kind of royalties that I've received down the years for academic publishing are so limited. This will vary from publisher to publisher. I don't on the publisher I work with, which is a kind of social enterprise, and frankly, I am very keen to support them, so I'm very happy for the royalties to go back. Other publishers, people will receive royalties, but I will be candid, anyone who publishes regularly with major academic publishers knows that unless you're very, very lucky, or more seriously, if you're perhaps writing a textbook or something of that kind, you won't make a lot of money. Most modern monographs in history, my area, sell hard copies in the hundreds rather than the thousands. If it gets into the thousands, it's the very low thousands. So frankly, even if you look at the royalties on that, you're talking, I think my last royalty check from one publisher was a total of about £10. Now, admittedly, it's 15 years ago. Would it be more than that, when it came out? So I suppose if I had a kind of a caveat about open access, if you're publishing a textbook which you really think has potential to sell very well, you might want to think about it. And if you're writing a book that you think for which there is a very large audience, you might want to think about it. But that is a very small proportion of what most historians and indeed most academics actually do. And even those who think their books are going to sell, in my experience, they don't. So my advice on the royalties question would be get real. It's not really why we publish monographs. We know 99.9% of the time we don't make much money out of it. But the arrangements for most publishers will be identical to what they are for traditional copies.
And finally, do you have any advice for other academics who are considering publishing their books open access?
I would say do it. I was quite involved in what you might call the early stages of open access. This is back in the early 2000s when I was involved in a learned society, taking their sort of monograph series open access. There are lots of issues around open access relating candidly to the funding of it, funders, UKRI, that's grant, the main research grant awarding body in the UK, who do make funds available, but for work not funded by them, it's tougher. But these aren't really things for authors to worry about. They're something to talk to their institution about, if I can put it that way. From an author's point of view, I see almost entirely positives and really almost no negatives. I would also have to say that whatever one's personal view about open access, this is the way that the world is moving like not. If we look at journals, we look at the way that UK research funders operate, both those who give out grant income and called the Research Excellence Framework, that's distributes sort of research money in the UK, they already mandate open access for journals. Although there's been some delay in moving that to books, it will come. So I actually would say open access publishing, I think, is good for the individual. It gets you a bigger audience. It gets a wider audience. But I also think it is the way that academia is moving, because there is quite a powerful sense that research is funded by the state, and therefore that research ought to be accessible. And it's a position which I do have sympathy, though it raises some very tricky questions for universities about funding. But as an author, that's not really your concern.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
That's great. Thanks.